Good evening, community. My name is Angelica, and I've been married to my husband Eden for over 10 years. My husband's family is a bit strange, not because they have odd behaviors or do peculiar things, but rather because very ugly or disturbing things have happened to them, to put it another way. Once, when we were dating, my husband told me something his sister Alma, my sister-in-law, had experienced, and I didn't quite believe him. But sometime later, she herself told me, and just remembering it makes me want to vomit. My husband's family is from a small town on the outskirts of Acatempan, heading towards Tixla in Guerrero. This incident happened in 2001, a time when my sister-in-law says there were still adobe houses, corrals attached to the fields, and dirt paths that turned into pure mud during the rainy season. When everything happened, my sister-in-law Alma was only 19 years old, though she looked a bit younger. She was thin, dark-skinned, one of those girls who were already helping with everything around the house from early on. Her mother and father were country folk, very hard-working, by the way, but also very strict, the type who wouldn't ask many questions. First, they'd scold you, and then, maybe, they'd listen. My sister-in-law recounts that one afternoon she was washing clothes with her mother and accidentally spilled bleach on one of her father's shirts, one of the few nice ones he had, which he wore to go to town on Sundays. She says that as soon as she saw the white stain bloom, she felt like she couldn't breathe, because she knew exactly how her father was about such things. And of course, her mother wasn't going to defend her either. So, instead of facing them for what she had done, she ran off to hide in the horse corral. She did it thinking that her parents' anger would pass in a while, but it didn't. Her parents knew perfectly well what she had done, and also knew where she was hiding, but they just didn't go after her. They let her stay there, because according to them, she would return on her own to receive her punishment. But Alma was very stubborn and also very scared, so she stayed in the corral until sunset. Then night fell, and since she was embarrassed to go back, she settled among old sacks and piles of straw, thinking that at dawn she would see how to fix the problem. She told me that that night the corral smelled strongly, like damp earth, manure, leather, and stored grass, while the horses were restless as if they sensed something very bad. Sometimes they would kick the ground, snort, but she, out of sheer exhaustion and fear, ended up falling asleep with an old blanket that was lying around. My sister-in-law Alma says that very late at night she woke up with a jolt because she felt something cold and thin crawling on her crotch, right below the long skirt she was wearing. At first she thought she was dreaming, but then she clearly felt it moving on her thighs, very slowly, as if looking for a place to enter. She wanted to scream, but from fright, she froze. And then she felt a tiny prick, a very slight but very ugly pain in her intimate area, as if something very small had bitten her or had gotten inside. She jumped up in fright, shook her skirt, and ran out of the corral almost crying. But in the darkness, she couldn't see exactly what had happened. Alma ran into the house, got in somehow, and curled up in a corner until morning. When the sun came out, her parents scolded her terribly for what she had done to her father's shirt. They didn't ask her how she had spent the night, or why she was so pale. They just gave her a good reprimand about the clothes and immediately put her to work. Alma said she felt shame, anger, and fear, but she didn't tell them what she had felt in the corral because she thought they wouldn't believe her or would call her a liar. Her life continued with the usual chores, but a few weeks later she started feeling quite strange. First, it was a heavy tiredness, then swelling in her abdomen, and 2 weeks later, she could no longer hide it. Her belly was noticeably swollen, truly and incredibly so, as if she were half a year pregnant. Her mother was the first to notice, and nearly went crazy with anger. She asked her who she had been with, who the man was, where she had seen him, since when they had been hiding. Alma swore and swore that she hadn't been with anyone, that she didn't have a boyfriend, that she had never even been with a man, but her mother, instead of believing her more, got angry. Because of that, she took her to the village doctor to see what was wrong with her. He was an older doctor who had seen a bit of everything, but even he was a bit taken aback, as he told them that yes, the girl's body seemed like that of a pregnancy, but that it was not normal at all. The growth of her abdomen did not correspond to how long Alma had been pregnant. 2 months didn't look like 2 months. That belly would easily be 6 or 7 months along. Alma told me that when she heard that, she felt like the world was collapsing on her, because she herself didn't understand what was happening. Her mother left there furious and scared, because she knew that if Alma's father found out, all hell would break loose. And that's exactly what happened. One afternoon, while Alma was doing her chores with her rebozo tied around her waist, her father stared at her fixedly, specifically at her belly, and abruptly asked her what was wrong with her stomach. Alma recoiled, and seeing her father's gaze, she couldn't lie in any way, so she told him the whole truth, the same she had always told, that she didn't know, that she hadn't been with anyone, that she didn't have a boyfriend, and that she was still a maiden. But of course, her father didn't believe her, and right there and then, he gave her a beating that left her head ringing, and blinded by shame and rage, he kicked her out of the house because his daughter was trash. Alma left the house crying, not knowing where to go, and the only thing that came to her mind was to go to her maternal grandmother, who lived a little far from the village, near a stretch of woods where people said strange things sometimes appeared when evening fell. Alma's grandmother, by the way, was a midwife, a traditional healer of the old kind, a very serious woman, one of those ladies who knows a little bit of everything. Of course, Alma arrived, shattered, and told her grandmother everything. About the bleach, about the shirt, the corral, the night, what she felt between her legs, the pain, the belly, the doctor, the beating, and that her father had kicked her out. She says her grandmother listened without interrupting her even once, just looking directly at her belly. When Alma finished, instead of scolding her, her grandmother just sighed and said, "Oh, child, I think you've drawn the short straw, but don't worry, everything will be resolved, God willing." Alma froze. She asked her what she meant by that, but the grandmother didn't answer at that moment. She just sent for her parents to resolve this matter that very instant. That same afternoon, both parents arrived, still annoyed, thinking that the grandmother had managed to find out who the father of the baby their daughter was expecting was, but no. When they entered, they saw Alma lying in bed, sweating, her belly so swollen it looked like she was about to give birth at any moment. The grandmother, who was in the kitchen, came out a little while later with an old bucket, one made entirely of old tin, which was full of warm milk. Right in front of the parents, she added a little honey to stir it slowly and placed the bucket at the edge of the bed, precisely towards where Alma's legs were open. Every time I reach this part of the story, community, I get very cold, because even Alma told it to me trembling, and if I'm telling it, it's because that's how things happened. But believe me, nothing pleasant. So, here it goes, and I hope you are not eating. Alma said that as soon as the sweet smell of the milk began to rise in the room, she felt a terrible cramping in her belly, one that resembled nothing human, even though it seemed like she was already entering labor, and then that pain suddenly subsided and went through her entire body. Alma began to scream, kick, and cry at that moment. Her mother wanted to approach, but the grandmother stopped her and told her not to touch her because it was about to happen. And so, out of Alma's legs began to come lizards. Yes, you heard that right. Small, thin, wet lizards, writhing like newborn offspring, and one after another came out as if it were a large litter. Alma says not one or two came out, but a lot, about 12 or 15, maybe 17 of them. She says she felt them slide out of her body and fall directly onto the sheet, and then she saw them run directly towards the bucket of milk, most likely attracted by the smell of the milk with honey, as this seemed to be their proper food. Alma's mother began to scream in sheer horror. Her father stood completely petrified, so much so that they couldn't believe what their eyes were seeing. The grandmother, on the other hand, didn't even move. She waited for the last of those things to fall into the bucket, and then, with a coldness that to this day scares me to imagine, she said, "It wasn't a pregnancy, it was something else." Then she picked up a stick, stirred the milk, and the lizards began to shake, writhe horribly, and drown, because the milk had poison, and that's what had killed them. When it was all over, the grandmother cleaned Alma, gave her a very bitter tea to drink, and finally explained to her parents what she believed had happened to her daughter. She told them that in the countryside there are sometimes damaged animals, creatures of the woods, and that they are not like others, and that in certain cases, male lizards, especially those that enter corrals and sleep among the heat of the beasts, can leave their evil within young girls. Unfortunately, the night Alma spent in that corral, one of those lizards entered her and had left her carrying it. It sounds crazy, of course, but Alma, with a look of shame, says she felt all the horror of a pregnancy. But what came out of her were those damn animals. Her parents, seeing what their own eyes had witnessed, practically tearfully apologized to their daughter. But she no longer wanted to return with them ever again. The beating, the distrust, the humiliation had left a deeper wound than anything else she had suffered at that moment. That is why Alma decided to stay and live with her grandmother for a good while. With the years, Alma made her life, of course. She got married, had healthy children, built her house, and moved on, like many women who have gone through horrible things. And she still finds the strength not to break after what she went through when she was just a young woman. But she has never been able to fully overcome that episode. Community. This story was told to me when she was 19 years old. Well, I had to change the age so there wouldn't be legal problems with the platform. So with that, I can confirm that this story was even more disturbing than you think. And believe me, my sister-in-law told me it was true. If you are enjoying the story, you support us a lot by giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you consider it and we've earned it, you can also hype our video so that more of the community can hear us. We continue. Jonas Craintley Leche Zacatecas. And even though when one leaves the village, you think you've left certain things behind, the truth is that there are stories that stick with you, almost like a cultural tradition to tell them. What I'm about to tell is an old story, almost a legend, that was told to me when I was just a kid. First as a warning, and then when I was older, as something serious. The kind people don't tell to entertain themselves, but so that one becomes aware and doesn't get greedy or curious, because many people say they have seen this type, and they say it's not pleasant at all. Over there, on the outskirts of my village, along an old dirt road where field workers used to pass, there's a place they call the Pirul of the Hill. It's an old, twisted tree, even ugly to look at when night falls. During the day, it looks like any dry pyrrole tree from the woods, but at night, even the air feels different around there. Well, the thing is, it is said that it all began in 1985 with a man named Joaquin. Joaquin, it is said, was 42 years old back then. He also had a wife and 4 children, if I'm not mistaken. Unfortunately, Joaquin was one of those men who were never satisfied with anything. I'm not going to say he didn't work because he did. He worked the land very hard, planted, harvested, and sold the little that came out. And yet, he couldn't get ahead. But Joaquin's problem wasn't just poverty. The problem was the anger he felt at not having more than others. It bothered him to see others with trucks, with livestock, with houses made of solid material, while he was still counting coins in his hand. People say he even got married more out of interest than love, because his wife came from a family with a bit more money than his. But even then, his luck didn't change much. He remained a bitter man, one who, instead of being grateful for what little he had, poisoned himself thinking about how much he lacked. It is said that one night, returning from his lands, he was grumbling aloud as usual. Many of the elders used to say that Joaquin didn't speak to himself as one who thinks, but rather he was cursing his life, his house, his wife, his children, his luck, and even God, because he said it wasn't fair that he continued to be poor. The road was dark, barely lit by the moon, and as he passed in front of the pirul tree on the hill, he saw a man standing right by the trunk. That man, it is said, was very short, a little over 1 meter tall, dressed in dark clothes with a hat, somewhat like a peasant. The gentleman says he wasn't a child, nor did he look like a circus dwarf. He was more like something else. Joaquin stopped abruptly, because that man called him by name just like that, as if he had been waiting for him. "Joaquin, do you really want money?" That was the first thing he blurted out, without greetings or pleasantries. Then he told him that he could give him everything he desired so much. Money, power, a long life, the kind that lasts long enough to see everyone else grow old, except him. Joaquin, although scared, was no fool. He knew from the beginning who he was facing. He says the air had become colder, the animals stopped making noise, and only the pirul tree moved, even though there was no wind. Still, greed won out faster than fear, and he asked what the man wanted in return. The short man smiled and told him he didn't want much. He just wanted 6 innocent souls, and the more innocent they were, the better the payment. Community, the worst part of this story is that Joaquin accepted that deal. Just like that, easily, without really thinking, without measuring that he would lose more than just his life. They say he didn't even cross himself. He just said yes, like closing a deal for livestock. And from then on, his life took a completely unexpected turn. In a short time, he started to prosper. He bought land, livestock, tools, then gold, because he had so much gold that he didn't even know what to do with it, as money came to him as if it were sprouting from the earth itself. People said that perhaps he had finally had a good harvest. But then the rumors started, of course, because it wasn't normal for someone so broke to get rich so quickly. But at the same time, the misfortunes began. His children, still adolescents, began to get sick in rather strange ways. It wasn't a cough, or a fever, or something that lasted days. It was more like something terrifying, as the lives of the poor young men were extinguished almost from one moment to the next. One would wake up with body aches and by the afternoon would practically be dying. Another would start with a chill and a while later wouldn't even speak, so that at the end, over the months that Joaquin had made that deal, his 4 children passed away. People saw Joaquin cry at the funerals. They saw him scream, beat his chest until he threw himself on the ground like a madman. But those who know this story say they were simply crocodile tears, because he knew exactly why his children were dying, as he himself had handed them over that night in the deal. This story still has a lot more community, because if you remember well, they asked him for 6 souls, and he had only delivered 4 by then. 2 were missing. Over the years, Joaquin and his wife had 2 more children, and fate didn't let those 2 grow either, dying practically as babies. One didn't even manage to walk well before he was gone from this world. The other was just starting to babble when a very strange fever took him. And that's when Joaquin's wife, it is said, broke inside, because she knew it was as if a curse was chasing them. She even asked Joaquin if he hadn't done anything strange, if he knew something he wasn't telling her, because many rumors were circulating in the village, and she listened to them all very attentively. But the man always denied everything, saying that it was God's will that things were that way. But on the contrary, it wasn't God who wanted that. Joaquin's wife was never the same again. She continued to live in that large house, of course, full of things, luxuries, but already practically like a shadow. And Joaquin continued to get richer and richer, but also drier, quieter, and uglier in character, as if money had filled his pockets but emptied his soul. So the years passed, community. His wife also died, old and consumed by so much sadness, leaving Joaquin alone in that world. He had gold, land, money saved, livestock, valuables that they no longer even knew what to spend on, but he had no children or grandchildren, but no one to sit with him and chat or go out for a walk. It was then that, already old, he began to live in fear, because it's one thing to sell what you love for ambition, and quite another to reach the end and realize that all that you had asked for was useless. They say that at night they heard him cry, even that he spoke to himself, that he asked for forgiveness from someone unknown, and that by then, he didn't even sleep. It is even said that he claimed to see many children standing in his house, in his yard, looking at him very directly as if they were judging him. And it is believed that they were the souls of his children who were tormenting him. It is thus told that one night, near the end of his life, he took several sacks full of gold and took them to the same tree where he had initially made that deal, the Pyrol of the Hill. That night, he went alone, dragging himself as best he could, and there he called out to the same entity to ask it to let him rest in peace, to take his gold, to take away that torment, that he had suffered enough, meaning, in short, he wanted to undo the deal he had made many years ago. But as they say, the devil knows more from being old than from being the devil. It is said that that being appeared again, and it was the same short man as before, the same voice, the same horrible smile, and against all expectations, it is said that the being heard Joaquin and agreed to let him go, but with a rather strict condition. He told him that yes, he could let him rest, but in return, he needed 7 more souls, 6 for the ones he had given from his own blood, and 1 more soul to save his own soul. It is thus told that after that, Joaquin simply disappeared. They never found his body. They never knew if he died, if he had left, or if he had simply gotten lost in the woods. The only thing that remained of him was this legend, because since then, community, at that tree, they say a very old man appears, a thin one with a long face and deep-set eyes, who speaks to those who pass by only at night and who are in great need of money. This being, it is said, is the soul of Joaquin. He promises them exactly the same thing that was once promised to him: money, power, abundance, and a better life, assuring them that all the gold he had in life was buried there and that the only way to earn it was by accepting his deal. But the price he asks in exchange for his gold is not just 6 souls, but he asks for 7 innocent souls. Because Joaquin, it is said, is looking for some gullible fool who wants to take his place so that finally someone else will carry his torment and he can stop appearing under that cursed pyrrole tree. I have never gone there at night, community, and I don't want to see that tree either. But many people from the village say it is completely true, and that at that tree, very late at night, one encounters quite strange things. And yes, the soul of the man still appears to anyone who is in need of money. And yes, he also asks for 7 souls, 1 for each of his children, and the last, the 7th, to save his own soul. And woe to that poor fool who accepts that deal because he is simply looking for a replacement. Family CH, I remind you that we have new videos every day and live streams every Tuesday and Thursday nights. We await you to tell us your story. We continue. Hello, family of storytellers, and a big greeting to all. And I hope you don't take what I'm about to tell as a joke, because even though it sounds very unreal, there are 2 witnesses who say it happened, and it was much worse than you will hear. In my family, there were always stories that kept you up at night after hearing them. Stories of apparitions, of shadows on the roads, of witches lurking in all the woods. But the most terrifying of all that I have ever heard was experienced by my 2 older brothers, Jorge and Roberto, one afternoon they will never forget. I was just a child at that time, but I remember it because they were almost crying when they told our parents that night it happened. What I'm going to tell happened in the 1990s. Community, in a rural area of Morona, Santiago in Ecuador, a land of green mountains, crystal-clear rivers, and jungles that seem to have no end. My brothers at that time were young farmers who spent their days tending the cornfields and the animals they were in charge of. Life in the countryside is very routine, almost nothing out of the ordinary. But sometimes what happens is so strange that no one believes you. And that's what happened to them. That afternoon, as my brothers remember, they decided to take the family goats to the river to drink some water. For this, my brothers were accompanied by their 2 dogs, Fiero and Tigre, faithful guardians who never left them alone, neither my brothers nor the goats. The sun was high in the sky, and it was past 2 inches the afternoon when they arrived at that river. The water was low and calm, barely reaching their knees. They say they had never seen anything strange. It was a safe place where the animals always quenched their thirst. The goats approached to drink, moving their heads from side to side while the dogs lay down nearby, watching that everything was calm. Everything seemed normal, until suddenly the animals trembled very strangely. Absolutely all the goats, raised their ears and began to bleat desperately, their hooves striking the bank as if they wanted to flee in haste. The dogs at the same time got up abruptly and began to bark furiously, looking towards the water. "What's wrong with them?" Jorge asked, confused. Roberto also got up, worried, because in all the years they had been tending the goats, they had never seen the animals react that way. The river was clear, they could see the stones at the bottom. There were no crocodiles or caimans there. In fact, there were none of those in the entire region, much less large fish that could have scared the goats in that way. But then, what did they see? Jorge was the first to point with a trembling voice. "Look, brother, look at this down there in the water." They both leaned over the bank, and what they observed almost made them faint. Beneath the still water, a gigantic shadow extended. It was an elongated figure so large that it seemed to have no end. But what terrified them the most were the red eyes that beast, or that thing, had. My brothers say that those looked like 2 enormous orbs, red as embers, that stared at them fixedly from the depths of that water. The hearts of the 2 farmers began to pound forcefully. That thing was not a simple fish. What they were actually seeing was nothing other than a serpent, a beast over 10 meters long, with black skin and grayish spots that shone under the water. "Run for the machete!" shouted Roberto, backing away in fear. The goats launched themselves towards the bank, barking incessantly at that serpent, as if they wanted to protect their owners from everything that was happening in the river. The brothers barely had time to grab their weapons when the surface of the water broke with a roar. The serpent burst out, throwing a jet of water and mud all around them. What I'm telling you, community, is real, because they experienced it like this. My brothers say that that serpent, came out so quickly that its body launched itself like a whip, one as thick as a tree trunk, and with a head as large as that of a calf. The goats bleated in terror, running in all directions out of pure fear. Our dogs, Fiero and Tigre, launched themselves to bark with much more fury, placing themselves between the beast and the farmers. My brother Jorge brandished his machete, cutting the air, while Roberto retreated with his very high. The serpent hissed with a sound that didn't seem to be from this world. As my brothers had never in their lives heard an animal produce a similar noise, at the same time that thing showed them its shiny, sharp fangs. The creature tried to lunge at them, but my brothers stood firm, cutting with their machetes to keep it at bay. The metal clashed against the hard scales of that animal, barely leaving marks, because even though their machetes were very sharp, they were not capable of cutting the skin of that thing. The beast writhed furiously, throwing tail lashes that lifted stones and dirt. The dogs barked and jumped again and again, biting what they could, although they barely managed to scratch the serpent's skin. The confrontation lasted what seemed like hours, although in reality, it was only a few minutes. The air was filled with shouts, barks, and the serpent's hiss, and in a final movement, the beast turned quickly and lunged at one of the goats that was still lagging behind, paralyzed by the fear of what it was seeing. With a dry bite, it grabbed it, and before my brother could react, it dragged it back, disappearing with a loud splash that sent water in all directions. The water churned violently at that moment like never before. My brothers ran to the bank with machetes in hand, while the dogs barked desperately. But the only thing they managed to see was the dark silhouette of the serpent sliding under the water, and it went downstream, carrying the goat in its jaws. The red eyes flashed one last time on the surface before disappearing into the current. Jorge and Roberto stood motionless, their chests heaving, machetes still raised. Silence returned to the river, broken only by the nervous bleating of the goats that had still survived that attack. The dogs continued to bark at the water, refusing to calm down. But it was too late. The serpent had already taken that goat. My brothers looked at each other incredulously, unable to utter a word after all they had experienced. They knew that what they had seen was not an ordinary serpent. It was not an animal that lived near those waters. This was much older, much more ancient, much darker, like a creature from the nightmares of the elders. Filled with fear and almost on the verge of tears, they returned home and told everything they had seen. Since my brothers have never been liars, my parents believed them, as there were signs of the confrontation that afternoon with that enormous serpent. After that, they never returned to that place to give the goats water. Since then, they gave their goats water at other more distant streams. Although it meant walking a bit further, they risked returning to that cursed river, that place with that serpent. Over time, the story became a family secret. Jorge and Roberto hardly spoke of it, and when they did, they told it very quietly because they didn't like people finding out about it, as they would start saying they were crazy, or that they were people who were unwell. I, who have heard it many times, still tremble when I think that that black serpent with red eyes hides in the river of that village. They say that water sometimes holds secrets that one should never see, and every time I pass near that river, I feel that something is watching me from the depths. I just hope it's not that enormous serpent, that beast that lives there. And to all this, community. If you're wondering what on earth that serpent is, well, some people believe it's an ancient guardian of the river, and others that it's a monster, a beast, something that lives nearby and feeds on wild or farm animals. If you have a story you wish to share with this pleasant community, I invite you to send it, either by email or through our Facebook page. I would appreciate it if you activate all notifications to stay up to date with the daily uploads. Thank you very much for letting me reach your ears. I am the storyteller.